Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Richard Rosen, who's here to share with us his new book, Yoga by the Numbers, the Sacred and the Symbolic in Yoga Philosophy and Practice. So it's common knowledge that numbers play a meaningful role in the philosophy of many spiritual traditions. But did you know this also applies to yoga? Today's discussion with Richard is going to be very enlightening. Richard Rosen began his practice with Hatha Yoga in the 1980s in Berkeley, California. In 1982, he enrolled in the teacher training program at BKS Yoga Institute in San Francisco, graduating in 1985. 2 years later, with a couple of his friends, he co-founded the Piedmont Yoga Studio in Oakland, which closed its doors for the last time after 27 years in 2014. Richard is a contributing editor at Yoga Journal and has authored 4 books with Shambhala Publishing. So let's welcome to the show, Richard Rosen.
Thank you for having me.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. What inspired you to write this?
I was for many years associated with Georg Furstein. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He was one of the most respected yoga scholars in modern times. And Georg wrote over 30 books on yoga and tantra and other subjects. And one day I happened on a book he wrote, was titled Spirituality by the Numbers. And it got me thinking about yoga and numbers. So I decided there was some worthwhile stories about the numbers. So I proposed the idea to Shambhala, and they gave me the go-ahead, and here we are today.
Well, I am just delighted that you've written this book. There's so much great information in it. So your book title is Yoga by the Numbers. What does that really mean?
Well, yoga has a penchant for numbers, 5 of these, 10 of those. Sometimes the numbers are just numbers. But since yoga was once strictly an oral tradition, even after numbers had been introduced in India, numbering things helped the yogis remember a collection of specific teachings. 5 is quite prevalent, presumably because in a pinch we can count on it. We can count it on our fingers. But also, numbers often add a symbolic meaning to the numbered items. For example, the number 4, completion, means completion or stability. And why does 4 do that? Well, think of a simple table with 4 legs. It needs nothing more than those 4, and it's completely stable. So, for example, there are several prominent yoga texts with 4 chapters, the Yoga Sutra, for example, or the Vedanta Sutra that further divides the chapters into 4 parts. This announces that though the text might be interpreted in various ways, it's complete in itself and can't be added to or subtracted from. Yogis are also fond of huge numbers, very large numbers. There are, according to one text, 8.4 million asanas taught by Shiva. It's a number obviously meant to create a feeling of awe and humility. But then the yogis usually begin to pare the number down slowly to make it accessible to humans. So from 8.4 million asanas, that gets pared down to 84, then 32, then 4, and then finally 1. And this in turn generates a feeling that the one asana that's left out of 8.4 million is a distillation and a great value that is attached to that asana, or whatever's left over at the end.
That's just fascinating. And before we go too far down the road, I would love for you to explain the difference between a number and a numeral.
That's easy. A number is something you hold in your hand. And when you write that down on a piece of paper or whatever, it becomes a numeral. So I think technically the book should have been called Yoga by the Numerals, but that was too complicated.
Well, it's fascinating how you've brought all this together, and I was very impressed with this. So you're talking about the numbers. Let's talk about the number 0. What
That's a good one.
significance does that one hold?
Well, it's interesting. The English word 0 comes from an Arabic word. I can't pronounce it, but it's spelled Sifr. And this in turn derives from a Sanskrit word for 0 with shunya. The Hindus, yogis, know the supreme self as Brahman, which derives from a verb meaning to grow or increase. However, paradoxically, or it might be anywhere but in India, one of the names of Brahman is Shunya, or void. But here the plot thickens. Shunya is rooted in the verb shvi, which means to grow, swell, increase. Another paradox. In India, 0 is the point of balance between nothing and everything. For the yogis, to empty the mind opens you to the fullness of the absolute.
That's very impressive. It just so much a number means, a numeral means. That's very, very impressive.
Yeah.
You've done so much research for this book. Was there anything that really surprised you?
Yeah. Well, what surprised me was the number of numbers there are in yoga. I knew there was a lot going in, but when I started to dig in a little bit deeper, I found that I was almost overwhelmed by all the numbers there were. So I decided then to focus on 0 through 10 and bring in other numbers when the opportunity presented itself. I was also surprised that there's really no coherent or acceptable explanation for why 108 is so important in yoga. It's supposed to be a sacred number, but nobody seems to know exactly why.
Try and get down to the root of that. My goodness, that must have taken a lot of research.
I did a lot of research on that. I didn't find anything conclusive, but there are some suggestions that, for example, 12 times 9 is equals 108. And so there was some suggestion that 12 and 9 are both sacred numbers. So multiplied together, they would make it even more a sacred number. But I'm not quite sure about that.
In your book, you talk about the difference between higher consciousness and consciousness. I'd love for you to explain that for our listeners.
Well, I'm not quite sure that I should use the word higher, because that puts a value on it that makes it more seems more valuable than everyday consciousness. We have mundane consciousness, everyday consciousness, or what we could say consciousness with content, thoughts and feelings and dreams and whatnot. And in yoga, this is called chitta, Citta. And it has produced all of our worldly wisdom as well as our worldly problems. We wouldn't be who we are without chitta, for the better or worse. And though most people are not aware of this, we're also possessed of pure or contentless consciousness, which is consciousness without content, which is called chit in yoga, CIT. And it's impossible to know about this, not to know chit, because chit is the ultimate knower. So very logically, we believe that chitta is the knower, but as William Blake said, we don't see with our eyes, we see through our eyes, meaning that it's chit that's really the knower ultimately of all of our experiences. So these two consciousnesses are very closely related. I think chit can be compared to like a white movie screen, and chit is the movie that's being projected, or chitta is the movie that's being projected onto the screen. The screen never changes, no matter what the movie is that's being projected onto it. So in the same way, chitta is projected onto chit, and no matter what the thought or feeling is, chit always stays the same. It's always underneath our everyday experience. Now, the ideal would be for us to be rooted in chit, in the background consciousness, witnessing the movie being played out both outside ourselves and inside, and without judgment or expectation. This kind of witnessing, if practiced assiduously, has the potential to transform the nature of chitta. Nothing actually needs to be done, although perhaps combined with other yoga practices, the process of transformation might be speeded up. So I'm trying to say that chitta is really is in the foreground of our awareness. Chit is in the background, which is really the observer of everything we see and do and think. And yoga really wants us to get in touch with this background awareness, to be more conscious of ourselves as the white screen, as the receptor of all these outside impressions.
And it's interesting because I think a lot of times people will try to separate what they call higher consciousness and consciousness,
Yeah.
as opposed to looking at it all as consciousness.
Well, there's a lot to be said for everyday consciousness. I mean, it's produced our world and who we are. But yoga really wants us to get in touch with what's underneath that, what's really the observer of all of our daily activities and thoughts and feelings and whatever else we do during the day.
Yeah, it's kind of inviting us to go deeper.
Yes, exactly.
In your book, you talk about the question if the world is real or if it's a real seeming illusion. What do you mean by that?
Well, yoga has different ideas about what, the nature of the world. In some of the schools of yoga, the world of diversity and change is an illusion, in the sense that we believe it to be what the world really is and what it's truly like. But according to this teaching, all diversity and all change is ultimately united in one unchanging eternal source, which is named Brahman. Once we realize that, then the world of diversity is seen for what it is, a projection on the screen of the Supreme Self, Brahman, and the illusory nature disappears. The world still is there, but we understand now that it's not the ultimate reality. But there's another way of seeing the world, in which diversity and change is real, although the world itself is not conscious of that change. And so that world is brought to life by the presence of the self. So there's a separation in this particular view of the world between nature and the self. And without the background without the light of the self, this world is just not, it can't exist. So this is called dualism, and this posits a split between the self and nature. Then there's a third way of looking at things, which is that the world is a joyous expression of one source, and that one source is the link between all diversity. So the world is infused. This world is infused with intelligence and creativity, which. And one of the goals of yoga in this particular view is to live life as long as possible and enjoy being alive in this beautiful world. So there's really three ways of looking at the world in yoga. One is called monism, which means that all things are united in one source. Then there's a thing called dualism, a worldview called dualism, which posits that there's a split between the self and nature, and they have to come together to create the world. And then the third way is called triadism, which looks at the world in sort of like it sort of combines monism and dualism. Diversity is real, and it's united in the one, and the one expresses itself through diversity, and that's called triadism.
I think that's the best description of that I've ever heard that people can understand. So thank you for taking the time to go through that.
You're welcome.
So in Sanskrit, what does number 2 mean?
Well, 2 is duality. 2 is the Yoga Sutra, for example, the way it looks at the world sees that separation between self and nature. So 2 represents that duality, but it also stands for other things as well. For example, it can stand for the 2 wings of yoga practice, which is abhyasa and vairagya. In other words, effort and sort of doing and not doing, the balance between the 2. And the 2 also represents what's called the pairs of opposites, the dvandvas, the tutus. It literally means tutu, which is according to the Yoga Sutra, it pulls us it's like a tug of war between these two extremes. Like, for example, cold and hot are two opposites. And the practice in the classical system then is to bring these 2 together and to sort of rise above the duality, and that leads in turn to a more expansive consciousness when we're not pulled back and forth between 2 extremes. It's sort of a blending of the 2.
Is it kind of reminding us to stay in the present?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we all feel the tug between the 2 extremes every day, but yes and no, this and that. I want that. I don't want that. So yoga is telling us to rise above that, to rise above that duality. Just be neutral about the tug. Just sort of stay in the middle, walk a middle path, I guess is the best way to say it. Not be influenced by the tug of those 2 extremes.
A lot of times when people think of yoga, they think of, I'm doing the exercises and the stretching. So I guess we should start with what yoga is in regards to your book.
Well, first of all, yoga is an umbrella word. It covers a lot of different styles and practices. So it's really hard to say. It's like the word dog. There's just all sorts of kinds of different dogs. So there's all kinds of different yogas. So it depends on what kind of yoga you're talking about to get any kind of sense of what's going on. Some yogas are very body based, like Hatha Yoga is very, very physically based. But other yogas are based in consciousness, like the Yoga Sutra, classical yoga. There's really no asana in there at all, except for a sitting asana for meditation. The book is trying to express the idea that there are all these different numbers that express all these different ideas, and try to cover the range of different practices in yoga.
I think that this is such a good, for many people, introduction of what yoga can be as well. Not just, how you're talking about Hatha Yoga, where there's the movement of the body, but also when we look at the sutras, numbers, it covers a lot more.
Well, I hope so. Yeah. All yoga is geared to answer the one question: who am I? I mean, that's the basic question in all yoga schools. But they all go about it in different ways to find the answer to that question.
So earlier we talked about the number 4 in Sanskrit. So where do we find this in yoga?
Well, I mentioned earlier, I think that there a couple of significant texts in yoga history have 4 chapters, and that indicates that the book is complete in and of itself. Even one of the books with 4 chapters even subdivides the chapters into 4 parts, each chapter. There's lots of 4s all throughout Hindu teaching. For example, there's 4 ages in every yogic site, in every world cycle. There's just lots of 4s in all through yoga.
In your book, you talk about Shiva and Shakti. So how do these Hindu deities associate with numbers?
It's interesting because Shiva and Shakti are 2 sides of the same coin. Shiva is the masculine principle, Shakti is the feminine. And we talk about them as being 2 separate things, but they're really not. They're inseparable. They've got a very close marriage, so to speak. And the interesting thing about Shiva and Shakti is that it flips the Western ideas about masculine and feminine on its head. So in this way of looking at the world, it's Shakti, the feminine principle, that's the active principle that creates the world, whereas Shiva is the passive or receptive principle that observes the play of his spouse as she creates the universe. It's interesting that they're sort of like a duality that's blended into one thing.
I guess in many ways that can describe humans.
Well, I think the important thing to understand here is that we have 2 sides. And, a modern yoga is very geared to doing. It's very interested in action, in activity, and there's not a lot of passivity in modern. There's restorative yoga, I guess, is fairly popular, but most yoga classes are interested in doing, not receiving. So I think that what this is telling us is that we do have 2 sides that are really important to keep in balance: action and receptivity.
Well, and then I wanted to chat with you also about when we talk about prana. Is the teaching of prana unique to India?
No, I don't really know. I really can't talk on other cultures, but I do know that it's pretty worldwide teaching that cultures have this idea that the universe is sort of suffused with this life energy, and that we essentially live off this life energy by taking into our system. It's not unique to India by any means. There's teachings about universal energy all over the world at all times and all places, but I don't know enough about the other modalities to really say anything intelligent about it. Prana in India it's seen to suffuse the universe, and it's for Hatha Yoga. Prana is the energy of transformation.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I didn't know that until I started to get into your book. I was like, "Ooh, okay," because you cover so many different things that I think people would really be amazed by. And one is the word guru. Wait, what's the different, the deeper meaning to that?
Oh yeah, guru is a good one. In the old days, yoga was strictly an oral tradition. It was passed on from teacher to student by word of mouth. Firstly, because there was no writing in India until maybe the 4th or 5th century. But even after writing came in, it was still customary for the teachings to be passed on orally, because it recreated the initial teaching of the deity, sending down the sacred word at the beginning of each world incarnation. So guru, well, I should say that in yoga, they take words and they separate them out. They have a literal meaning, but they also have a figurative meaning or symbolic meaning. And then they do that. They create that meaning by separating the syllables out and giving the syllables different significant meanings, so that the figurative meaning adds some new dimension to the literal meaning. So the literal meaning of guru is weighty, heavy. He's heavy with spiritual knowledge. But then what they do is they take those two syllables, gu and ru, and they separate them out and assign different meanings to the two syllables. So, for example, in the most common example is gu means darkness and ru means light. So, guru is the person who leads you from darkness, from self-ignorance to self-realization. But there's also let me think. Gu also can mean like a wealth of knowledge, and ru can mean the person who illuminates that knowledge for the student. It's a very interesting thing that they do in yoga. Is they take these words and they separate them out and give them meanings. Like for example, the word hatha is separated into two syllables, ha and ta, and ha is signified as sun and ta is signified as moon, neither of which mean that literally. But the ha and the ta then indicate the two opposing energies in the body, the heating energy, the solar energy, and the cooling energy, the lunar energy. And that, as I mentioned before, about those are two opposites that are brought together in Hatha Yoga and balanced out in the central channel.
It's just so interesting how all these words and everything has such a deeper meaning. I can understand. Yeah, it's a lot.
That's right. It's one of the reasons why Sanskrit is so important. To have a little idea about how to find things in a Sanskrit dictionary. Anytime you read a yoga text in English, there's lots of things that are missing. The words are what are called polyvalent. They have very different meanings, and so it's really impossible for any translator, no matter how good the translator is, to get all the meaning of a Sanskrit word into one English word. A lot gets left out, and so I always encourage my training students to figure out to learn how to use a Sanskrit dictionary. It's really not that difficult, and be able to find out these deeper meanings for themselves. It adds a really new dimension to the practice.
Do you often read Sanskrit and then it has one meaning and then you go back later and it may have a different meaning that applies to you at that time?
Absolutely. I bought this text one time that I think at the Hatha Pradipika, and it had the original Sanskrit, the Devanagari, and it had the English translation, but it didn't have a transliteration. In other words, the Sanskrit wasn't put into Roman alphabet. So I decided to do it myself. And as I was going along, I came up. They were talking about how the yogi should set up his practice space, and they mentioned building a Vedi, a VEDI, which is a platform for practice. But it was very unusual because the platform is usually called an asana, which is which means seat. Asana was originally designated the platform the yogi sat on, and only later became a name for the position the yogi took on the platform. Anyway, I found the word Vedi instead of asana, and I decided to look that up. And as it turned out, a Vedi is an altar, and so the implication is in that text that the yogi is like a priest sitting on an altar, and he's also not only leading the sacrifice, but he's also what's being sacrificed in the practice. So the translator, who's one of the really best translators around, translated Vedi as platform, which is literally true, but it missed all that underlying signification.
It really just invites us to dive into it personally and see what the sutras are saying for us.
Absolutely.
Is that the same with everybody? That it's for them to dive into the sutras to see what's there for them?
Well, it depends on what kind of a student you are for yoga. I mean, a lot of people are just in it for the exercise, which is nothing wrong with that at all. Yoga done properly is a terrific exercise. It's also very therapeutic at times. But it's funny. Yoga is sort of like this stealth, sort of sneaks up on you. People come into the practice just interested in getting, stretching out their hamstrings or getting stronger, releasing the stress. But after a while, the yoga starts to work on them in such a way that they begin to be more curious about the background of what they're doing, and they begin to look into different books and texts, and they become more interested in the teachings behind the asanas. And sometimes it leads to very interesting transformations in their lives.
I can imagine. My goodness. Well, and with all the research that you've done on this book, which is heavily researched, is there something that you'd like to share with us and our listeners?
I just think that the numbers themselves can be very interesting. It's not very common to really think about the numbers and what they're supposed to mean and what they're supposed to do. Sometimes, like I said before, numbers are just numbers. In an oral tradition, numbers help to organize different kinds of teachings and help the students remember what was being taught. But numbers also have that symbolic dimension, which adds a whole new meaning to the practice. And I think it's really important to understand that numbers tell a story, just like words tell a story. Numbers tell a story too, in certain ways.
So, Richard, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Oh, that's very nice of you to ask that. I have a website, Richard Rosen Yoga, and I teach in Oakland at Nest Yoga, which is a wonderful little yoga school on Piedmont Avenue in Oakland. And I have an Instagram somewhere, but my daughter keeps track of that. But I'm not really heavily involved in the internet, in social media.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, thank you for having me. It was really a great pleasure.
Well, thank you, Richard. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Yoga by the Numbers, The Sacred and Symbolic in Yoga Philosophy and Practice. Yoga by the Numbers is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere books are sold. And if you don't see it on the shelf, just ask for them to order it, and please support our indie bookstores. You can also purchase this book from the publisher at Shambhala Publications at shambhala.com. Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.